Thank you everyone for joining today. We have another episode of the State of Cybercrime with Senior Director of Incident Response and Cloud Operations, Matt Radolec. He's joined by David Gibson, Senior VP of Strategic Programs here at Varonis.
It's great to connect with you, Aden. Happy and excited to talk with our audience about all the latest happenings in cybercrime and in the cyber world. Just to crack right into it, let's kind of go through some of the things that we're going to talk about today. If you haven't heard about LAPSUS yet, you're definitely going to hear all about that attacker group and how they carry out their attacks and how prolific they've been over the last few weeks. We'll give you some updates on the nation state attacks both from the intelligence side, as well as a little bit around a particular exploit being used by a nation state actor. We'll talk about the potential impact and really ask you for some feedback around what you think the impact will be of sanctions on cybercrime. We'll talk about some proposed regulation in the European Union, something called the Cybersecurity regulation, if I think I remember it correctly, David. And then we actually, and I want everyone to really start to think about this now. Recently there was a single sign-on and identity access management provider that was victim of an attack, and it got a lot of people thinking about how they would handle and react to that attack. So at the end of our presentation, we're going to go over a little bit of how to do a tabletop exercise around a single sign-on and identity access management imposter, or really what would you do if someone was able to take over one of your single sign-on or IAM admin accounts.
Yeah, it seems like more and more as we go through these attacks, the line between an attacker and an insider threat seems to start to converge a little bit or start to blur. So I think just we wanted to mention that as we go through these attacks, just stuff to be thinking about. How are you going to defend against these sorts of situations?
And as always, we love to hear from you in the chat and in the Q&A. We will be monitoring both of those throughout the presentation today, and we'll take some time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. We really love the engagement that we get with you guys, our audience. Let's get into it. In our first segment, we're going to cover, as usual, is there any good news? For those of you first-time viewers, oftentimes in cybersecurity, everything is doom and gloom. We're always talking about some vulnerability, threat actor, or impending attack that we should all be concerned about. But there is often some good news, and we have some to share with you. First and foremost, I think we can redefine what the term internet warrior means. And I think these internet warriors are the telecommunications or really the employees of the various different internet service providers in the Ukraine who are working through, an active war in an active war zone in order to keep the internet on. And how this has really benefited the Ukraine is they have a decentralized internet. And David, I know you're going to want to mention more about that and how it dates back to the founding of the internet. So you have a little bit more experience with that than I do. But what the Ukrainian Minister of Digital Transformation said is that the fact that there are so many different internet service providers, and with the help of Starlink, the internet has remained on, even though it's been targeted and been trying to taken down, and actual physical links have been separated and wires have been needed to be rerun.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, to see the internet kind of functioning as it was originally intended, where you wouldn't have a single point of failure, right? It could withstand some of these situations here where multiple nodes go down, and kind of seeing how that resilience is playing out right from the way DARPA, kind of conceived of it, I think.
Now, a lot of times we also tend to think about, if you commit a crime, does it carry with the time? Do you actually get a punishment that fits that? And I'd be curious about your feedback in the chat. David and I are both monitoring it. For one, Estonian man who carried out was found guilty of 13 different ransomware attacks. That landed him just over 5 years in prison. Now this attack cost 53 million in losses to those organizations. So one thing I'm curious about from you is, did the crime match the time? Did the punishment that this person got match the impact that it caused on both the economy and on those different businesses? We'll be taking a look at the chat over the next few minutes to see what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, keep the chats coming in. I'm using a 9600 baud modem, so yes, I do think that was an age joke on Matt. So
So, and what's a hot topic? What's everybody concerned about? It's definitely LAPSUS. This rather new and young hacking group has really caught the world's attention by storm, really because of a lot of the attacks that they've carried out. We've seen the attack on NVIDIA, which we covered in our last episode, as well as on Samsung. But since then, LAPSUS has been pretty busy. They've broken into LG, Ubisoft, EA, Microsoft, Okta, some of which we're going to cover in just a couple of minutes. But I think the thing to point out here is that the story seems to be the same. How these attackers are getting initial access a lot of times is through either an initial access broker or actually through their own recruitment, which we'll go over one of their recruitment posts in just a couple of minutes. And it really does beg the question. And one thing I want everyone to take away from today is how you would identify, I get asked all the time by customers, how do we catch a LAPSUS style attacker? And it really does start with the looking from the inside out and really evaluating how you would pick up on an attacker that's already inside of your environment, because many times that's how these attacks start. And David, I know you've done a lot of research into this and you're really passionate about it. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about what happened at Microsoft?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. One of the themes here is, what a single account, a single compromised account can do. This one, it looks like it started out with a single compromised employee account and got all the way to source code. Some of the interesting stuff I thought, that obviously the code's not open source, so it's not what you want to have your source code link. But they did mention that it wouldn't elevate the risk posture of clients because they're not relying on code obfuscation, or rather hiding their code, for security purposes. But the other interesting thing that I think came out of this was a breakdown of some of the TTPs of LAPSUS. So very similar playbook, as you mentioned, Matt. So credential stealing, right, or harvesting from dark web forums, right, public repositories, and stealing. They did at least one SIM swap attack where they took over a SIM card, I guess, to steal the multi-factor authentication PIN that would be texted to that number. And once they get in, the playbook is familiar, right? They use off-the-shelf tools to get more access, look for more credentials, look for tokens in Slack, right, in Jira and Teams, and then use those to get critical data like source code.
Now, David, you said a SIM swap there. You're not talking about swapping their logging and retention tool, right? You mean like the SIM in my phone, the physical card?
Great point. Yeah, not that kind of SIM. The SIM card in your phone. If somebody steals your credentials to Verizon or your phone provider, right, and you can kind of point the number to a new SIM that you can control, right, and then when you get the text for the multi-factor authentication, you're getting the text. So this would be, I guess, an MFA bypass technique, right, to basically steal your SIM, right, or not physically steal your SIM, but basically take over, steal your number, right, point it to a new SIM.
And you probably would have to get the provider to go along with this, right? You wouldn't be able to just plug the phone in, or maybe not in all cases.
Well, I think that has happened, right? If you get somebody at the phone store to do it, right?
Oh, that's true. They just do it. Yeah, you're right there in person.
Yeah, I think that's happened. But I also think that online, I think Verizon now has a way to kind of protect yourself from that, right? So that you require some additional security to actually point your number to a new SIM.
Now, that wasn't the only attack from LAPSUS in recent weeks. One that a lot of people are talking about, and it's gotten the security community really hot, was Okta.
Yeah, this one is, playbook is very similar. I think, though, this one really brings third-party risk into play and how one weakness can lead into another and how interdependent we are. It started again with a compromised password, got into a VPN that was actually on a legacy network belonging to a company called Sykes, which is a customer service company that was acquired by Cytel or CTEL. I'm not sure how you say that. But this Sykes was working for Okta. They had outsourced their customer support to Sykes. And at any rate, they got into the VPN by a compromised account. moved around using off-the-shelf tools, eventually found a password file with clear text passwords in 365. I think it was a spreadsheet. Somebody had dumped out their LastPass into the spreadsheet with all their passwords. By the way, Matt, I mean, we find these kind of clear text passwords all the time in risk assessments, right? I mean, this is one of these things that we uncover that is a big.
Yeah, absolutely. I think even your best admins and some of your most trusted developers probably have keys and passwords in plain text on their computer. And it's easy to think when you're in that role, like, oh, this password is only for a dev environment. There's no sensitive data on it. But if it's like a domain joined account, and it has the rights to log on to other machines, you might not think about like the real implications of it. Now, obviously, it's a bad practice to store passwords on plain text, period. And it is something that we often find in Varonis risk assessments. I would actually say pretty much every single one.
It's definitely something to look out for, and this is, you know, this was one of these cascading failures. I think they were able to use that password to give themselves tenant admin access, really creating a back door in Cytel. They created an email forwarding rule so that they would intercept emails, but meanwhile, the support agent, one of the support agents worked for Okta, and they were able to get onto his virtual desktop, which could or was logged into Okta's Okta. So from there, you can basically access all the applications behind that. And I think that's where those screenshots, like these screenshots on the right, are coming from. So I think, you know, one of the things I think is interesting on this is how visibility in one area, right? If you're really just looking at perimeter or just looking at the identity, you know, and very strong at looking at that, it can kind of maybe keep you from thinking about other areas. It reminds me of that old joke, you know, why are you looking for your keys over there? If you lost them over there, well, the light is better over here. I guess that my point is that sometimes it can be, if you're not used to looking beyond that initial access vector, that initial intrusion, like if you're focused on looking at the perimeter, that you might not think to check like, okay, what is the access to the data behind it or the resources behind it?
And I think, you know, for those of you that want to learn more about this is the concept of SSO imposter that we talk about a lot. This is actually something at the end of the webinar today, we'll be able to offer you guys a firsthand look into what it's like to take over an admin account of a single sign-on service, and you know, like what the damage could be carried out, again, related to that tabletop exercise, because the risk that you want to be concerned about, it isn't necessarily just your admins doing the wrong thing. It's someone taking over their accounts, because you have the ability as an administrator of one of those platforms to impersonate or reset the password of anyone, meaning that, like, and I can't imagine how many people on this webinar now, even if you guys just want to use the hand rain function, use Okta today to like log into things. Like I can open up a page and get single sign-on through a lot of different applications. That means that an administrator at my organization would be able to do that as me. And there's a lot of things that are behind it. There's a lot of sensitive information or sensitive applications that gives them access to. And this is just a risk that this breach has gotten a lot of people thinking about. Now, you know, definitely number one question I've been asked for the last couple of weeks is, how could this happen, right? LAPSUS actually recruits your employees and your third-party contractors as one of their primary methods of entry. So, you know, and just think about this, right? What's the price of Bitcoin right now? I'm going to guess it's probably, you know, 45,000 or maybe a little bit more than that. Maybe somebody in the chat is watching the ticker closer than I am, right? Imagine that someone approached you and said, you know, I'll give you a Bitcoin if you will give me your username and password and approve an authentication request. Well, maybe you wouldn't do it for one Bitcoin. Would you do it for 5? Would you do it for 10? And these are the things, and, you know, thanks whoever just put in the chat that one BTC is right around 47,000 US dollars right now. You know, what would it take for you to give up remote access into your environment? Now, flip that on the head. For all of the security practitioners here, how would you identify that? How would you pick up that someone, like an internal employee, you know, accepted a bribe and gave access to an external third party into your environment, potentially even approving a fraudulent MFA request? that's pretty difficult to detect. And we'll talk a little bit about in a couple of minutes what some security practitioners are suggesting, and we'll go over our recommendations as well. Now, let's also talk a little bit about some of the bragging that LAPSUS was doing around like the success of those attacks. And one of those things, I can't tell you the number of times where I have conversations with an organization around, what would be considered impossible travel or geo-hopping style alerting. It's something that seemingly everyone seems to have, but I'm going to, we often do a segment, don't make me tell you I told you so. I hope you're looking at it because, LAPSUS openly admitted to logging in both from Germany and the USA with a compromised account at the exact same time. And it didn't seem like anyone was able to notice. They were also able to, add and re-enroll additional devices in multi-factor authentication without anyone noticing. This is actually a concept we've covered in previous episodes when we talked about how did back when, the notorious SolarWinds breach happened, how did, famous security research firm FireEye/Mandiant pick up on it? An employee had a fraudulent MFA email registration get sent to them, and they reported it to the SOC. That was how they found out about that breach. In addition to that, and I've seen a lot of comments in the chat so far around the strength of multi-factor authentication. There is no panacea with multi-factor authentication. It isn't a one, control to catch them all. It's a very strong control. It definitely defeats things like brute force attacks. But one thing that LAPSUS did to get around multi-factor authentication was actually spam you with phone calls. So if you got 100 phone calls in the middle of the night saying, will you authorize this? Will you authorize this? You might eventually press 1. You might eventually, just to get that phone call to stop, not really realize what's going on. Maybe it's the weekend and you're really tired, or you were out partying with friends. It only takes you authorizing that request one time for that attacker to then subsequently impersonate you. And that really raises the question on like, well, what can we do about it? I want to give a shout out for those of you that don't know or follow Dave Kennedy. He might be considered, like one of the originals in the cybersecurity space, author of many books on hacking, pretty much wrote the book on using Metasploit. And he had some comments on Twitter about specifically how you might pick up on LAPSUS. And what he really talks about is how they go after and take advantage of the gaps in detection on things like endpoint controls, like antivirus, which is a topic that a lot of people find to be a little bit taboo. But I really want to talk with everybody head on about, if you're not looking for things and you can't monitor things, even just pure visibility, you're missing something. You're not even able to go back in and do an investigation to determine if something happened. One of the gaps we often find is people not looking at things like what happens inside of their single sign-on providers or inside of their SaaS applications that they believe are inherently safe and protected by multi-factor authentication. The other thing, and one of our audience members beat me to this, is really the power of using a behavioral analytics engine, something that's looking for changes in behavior as opposed to just signature-based, like this looks like this piece of malware. And I think a lot of security programs have found and believe themselves to be quite secure and mature, but you have to look at the names of some of the companies that LAPSUS has targeted and successfully infiltrated. These are organizations that are mature, that have invested millions, tens of millions, or even potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in their security programs. And so, there again, the main point here is there is no security panacea. There is no shortcut for not being able to look at things and really kind of pick up on the abnormalities or what goes bump in the night. Now, David, I think you had some things here that you had noticed that Krebs had talked about. Do you want to give us a little bit more details here?
I thought this was a really great point. Thinking about the damage you can do just at that first compromise, right? We get one employee. What can we get? And I think it's a different, kind of problem set that we're used to solving is, all right, let's look at the potential for damage with this compromised account. What's all the data that they could go grab? And how would we potentially detect the unusual behavior, right, from this account in time to defend against it? So, this concept of the blast radius, one compromised account, what can they get? That's something that I think is a really important frame to put around this problem.
I think the other thing that this kind of makes me think about too is like, it's always easy to think that like a nation state actor is going to just do this one thing, or a cyber criminal is going to do this one thing. And when we look back to like Conti leaks, which we did a whole highlight and special edition episode on, which I'm sure my hosts can help us send a link for those of you that might have missed one of our last episodes, we talked about the large, very organized, highly communicative crime ring, whereas LAPSUS is fairly small and fairly new. And new to the scene. So you can't always predict what the next attacker group is going to look like. And it's why oftentimes, a lot of the basics in security can go a long way. The other thing, and again, one of our audience members, I had already mentioned this, we do have one last piece of good news, which is that a number of arrests have been made for some of the teenagers, and I did not misspeak there, who were arrested as being a part of the LAPSUS hacking group, including one of the, quote unquote founders, who, has profited double-digit in millions of dollars already. I think this really speaks to the power, or if you have the time and the motivation to dedicate to carrying out one of these attacks, you don't need to be too sophisticated in order to do it.
Yeah, and it's not like that teenagers can't be sophisticated. That we've seen that that's not true at all. But I think the interesting thing is how much of the knowledge here is easily found online and easily learned. And we've seen some of these techniques here as just off-the-shelf tools. You can Google and download and get to the next step. By the way, this was a great episode.
Is this Scooby-Doo, David?
Of course.
Okay. I only recognize one of the characters. Now, let's. I'm really curious. I'm hoping that one of our co-hosts can help us launch a poll here. What are you most worried about right now? Is it the teenage hacker group and the cyber criminal, or is it still the looming threat of a nation state actor? I'm really curious to see what everybody thinks about this. We'll give everybody a minute. Or is it Bob in accounting? Really curious to see what everybody thinks, their greatest threat is, to their organization right now. Give you guys a couple of minutes in order to answer. So as it turns out, most everyone is concerned about a threat from the inside. They're worried about Bob from accounting, with a good number of people also being worried about nation state actors. Now, what's really interesting is I think that right now, while there is this large and very scary and looming threat of a nation state attack that is seemingly like even difficult to imagine or fathom, and we'll talk about nation state attacks in a second, in terms of likelihood, your highest likelihood attack is going to come from an insider followed by a cyber criminal. You probably have an insider that's leaking data right now if you're at any organization of size. It might not be for invalid, it might just be an accident. They might not realize that they're, not keeping the privacy or the security of data safe with what they're doing. But that is likely, the most likely occurrence. And a cyber criminal, they cast a very, very wide net, whereas oftentimes nation state actors have a very particular motivation in mind. And I imagine that we have pretty diverse audience here on the phone, people that might be not in countries like Ukraine that are under attack, or it might be, not in an industry that a nation state actor would particularly target right now. I also just want to shout out that there are a lot of contribution in the chat. We're definitely going to take a look at those things that are coming in, and you guys are as hilarious as always. So if you ever see David or I just kind of smiling off to the side, it's because we just read something.
Yeah. It's a nation state that hired a teenage hacking group to bribe your Bob.
Oh, to bribe Bob from accounting. I guess, next time, and I'll ask our hosts who are following along, let's make sure we give an all of the above option for what we're most worried about, because I think that audience member definitely nailed it. So let's talk about, the nation state threats. This is still top of mind for a lot of people. And one of the reasons it is actually, for people here in the States, the White House issued a statement around, it was kind of vague about the evolving potential for a Russian government sponsored cyber attack. Now my question for you is, for those of you that are movie buffs, if you remember Die Hard 4 or Live Free or Die Hard, it introduced about 2007. It introduced this concept of a fire sale, where this wholesale attack on critical infrastructure by a nation state actor, and really in an effort to try to bring down both like the U.S. government and the U.S. economy. Do you think that that's what this style of attack would look like? Because, you see cyber criminals like LAPSUS, they're doing like a smash and grab job, where what we expect the government actors to do is really lay low and act in coordination. And really, I get asked about clients about this all the time. Just because they haven't done anything yet doesn't mean that they're already there. Especially when we think about like the FSB, for instance, and David, I know you're going to mention more about this in just a couple of minutes, but oftentimes, one of their MOs is actually compromising a piece of critical infrastructure and doing nothing. Just holding on and retaining that compromise and not actually letting you know that they're present inside of your networks, unlike a cyber criminal who, is trying to commoditize, turn the data that they stole from you into Bitcoin. Now, talk to us, Dave, if you don't mind, about the sizzle or about this particular topic.
Yeah, I think if anybody is wondering about nation states being overblown, totally agree that they're a huge concern. And I think this CISA alert kind of provides a little color there. Talks about some indictments that were based on activity between 2011, 2018. Attacking industrial control systems that run critical things, from water plants to pipelines to nuclear power plants. The TTPs that they used, I think, very, very recognizable. Spear phishing was very successful to get in. They're using this Triton malware. Since a lot of these ICS systems run similar software, they can be vulnerable to similar malware. And we've seen these attacks. I mentioned the water treatment plants and other critical infrastructure. We've seen them successful in the past. I think, one of these, it was just one mistake in the code prevented an explosion. It looked like they actually had intended to carry out something more damaging. But I think the point that you made there is that the penetration and the attackers were, could lurk inside the systems for months, right? And not pulling the trigger. They were kind of preparing. And I think, there's a fear factor there, right? Now we know the potential, but I think this is still a very real thing. It's if you're not thinking about who else might already, or who might already be in, what damage could they potentially do? That's a failure of imagination.
Yeah, and I think just one thing I just want to echo, the energy sector, power sector, anything in aerospace or military technologies, financial services. You are who all of the intelligence says is the target of these types of attacks. And so when we think about likelihood, and we're gauging the likelihood of you to be the target of a nation state actor versus an insider threat versus a cyber criminal, depending on industry, that barometer of risk changes. It definitely, if you're in the energy sector, you are the target that CISA is warning about. But the other thing I want to mention about these types of CISA alerts, and again, just give a shout out to another cybersecurity practitioner. We've spotlighted some things from Dave Kennedy. We've spotlighted some things from Brian Krebs. For those of you that don't know, Robert M. Lee, big time specialist and expert, especially in the ICS space, wanted to share some feedback on, and I definitely wholeheartedly agree with, on some of the recommendations from CISA on how to harden an ICS environment and things to do in response, like apply patches and microsegment everything. Definitely take a risk-based approach to following mitigations in an ICS environment. Applying all patches and mandatory updates to all your systems all the time automatically will likely lead to an outage, or potentially could even have catastrophic implications. There is a reason that a lot of more creative security has been implemented around ICS, especially heavily on the monitoring side and on the state management side, because you can't always just apply an update. That might mean bringing down the grid, which isn't always an option. And so, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Dave.
What's that Lord of the Rings meme that
Is it one does not simply is it walk into Mordor?
Patch your ICS systems.
Yeah, I think the right thing is, yeah. One does not simply patch your ICS systems, or even the same thing with a healthcare system. Now, I hope that all of this has really gotten everybody thinking about the threat actors that most likely be targeting you. But another topic that we've been talking about a lot at Varonis, and something we introduced on our last episode, is really, do you think that sanctions are going to increase cybercrime? So right now, Russia is under a lot of sanctions, and more. More countries are stepping up with trade blockades and no-fly zones and shutting down their business operations inside of Russia. Do you think that's going to lead to more cybercrime as a result? And we'll give everybody about a minute to answer this before we jump into the danger zone and talk about some of those vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question here. When people are faced with kind of radical situations here, radical circumstances, it can often create some radical responses. Let's see what people say.
Yeah, overwhelmingly, yes. I predict the same thing. If you don't have a job and you need to pay bills, or you need to put food on the table, crime is often what people resort to. I mean, that history, is destined to repeat itself, and that is one thing that history has taught us. And unfortunately, I think that a lot of technology-oriented individuals, perhaps even the youth, will turn to cybercrime, and that not all of the sanctions will have the intended results that we were hoping for. At least that's our prediction. Now, we did mention at the beginning today that there were some nation-state actors, carrying out, some exploitation on known and newly appointed vulnerabilities. We typically cover these vulnerabilities in a segment we like to call the danger zone. So let's jump in and let's take a look at those vulnerabilities. Now the first one, this is something, David, correct me if I'm wrong, actively being used by North Korean hackers, right?
Yeah, this was interesting. A bunch of issues in Chrome, kind of two flavors of exploit that I thought were interesting. There were a bunch that used this use after free weakness, which both of these, by the way, deal with memory and the abuse of memory. But the use after free, apparently, if you can point to a piece of memory that was supposed to be deallocated but wasn't, use that old pointer, and you can potentially reference or write to a place that then will be referenced by the new pointer. So essentially, you're using that old. There's a piece of code that still uses that old reference, and you can exploit that to write code that could potentially get executed by this by the new pointer. The other was a type confusion vulnerability, where if you're accessing a variable or an object via one type when it was defined as another, that could cause some of the same kinds of issues where you're overwriting, a larger memory segment, or calling, referencing memory out of bounds, so to speak. So, obviously the news is patch here. This is vulnerability in Chrome. So it could have been exploited there, and you kind of got to assume breach potentially and look past it. What would have the blast radius been if you had a compromised employee using Chrome with that vulnerability?
The other vulnerability I just want to mention, and for those of you that are running Sophos firewalls with automatic updates, it is already likely, the update is already likely applied, but a remote attacker with access to this particular Sophos firewall version's firewall user portal or web admin interface can do an authentication bypass vulnerability that leads to a remote code execution, which is why that CVSS score is so high. So what does that mean in a nutshell? It means that an attacker can send a specially crafted packet to one of these devices in order to execute code on that device as the administrative role on that device. That can be potentially impactful. Now, Sophos recommends that in addition to applying the patch, that customers disable WAN access to this user portal on this web admin page and actually use a VPN or the Sophos, what's called Sophos Central, which is their administrative interface for remote access and management of these devices. Hopefully, there isn't anyone on this particular show, today's show, that that has one of these firewalls that's sitting on the WAN. But if you do, check the version 18.5 MR3 and lower. We're affected by this very, very critical vulnerability and definitely want to apply those patches. Just another thing to add here, we've just covered two kind of pretty popular new vulnerabilities. There are tons that come out on a month-to-month basis. In fact, very recently, there were some critical patches found in a very popular mobile device in the iPhone that were patched. And so, the vulnerability management isn't going anywhere. It's definitely something that you want to stay on top of, especially when you find out things like nation state actors taking advantage of those vulnerabilities. Now, one other thing that we did want to mention is the European Union has put together some new draft cybersecurity rules deemed the Cybersecurity Regulation. Very creative name, if you ask me. Definitely curious to see if anybody else feels the same way. And it's really all about like establishing a baseline for risk management and implementing security controls, as well as conducting regular maturity assessments against that baseline and having your leadership's sponsors approve and actually help you carry out improvements to those risk mitigation strategies. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with ISO 20001, this is basically like almost identical to the ISO 20001 concept of your information security management system and getting one of those ISO 20001 certifications, where the idea is you understand your risk, you implement controls, and you demonstrate continuous improvement, because no security program is going to be perfect. Hopefully you've all picked up on that by now. And the other thing, and this is something we covered on our last episode as well, is sharing incident-related information with the European Union CERT without undue delay. Now, there are some regulations that say like you must notify within 3 days or 5 days. I don't think that in its current state, this regulation has specifics on that, but it does kind of bring up what we talked about in our last session, which was the importance of actually sharing the fact that you got hit by a particular attacker so that everyone else can react to it and it can potentially defend themselves against that attack. If you've got your phone out and you want to scan the QR code and give that draft regulation a read, you guys can do that now. But when we were preparing today's show, and going through this, David brought up a really great point, and I want to give you a chance to kind of share what do you mean by that's me? I mean, are you that's this regulation? Did you write it, David, or tell everybody what you mean by this?
It's assess your risk, assess the quality of your controls. Figure out what you need to do to optimize your preventive, detective, and corrective controls. Sounds totally crazy.
Yeah, not something you've ever suggested before. Never been on a public show with thousands of participants like today, where we're telling people to carry out basic security controls like that.
It's just nuts. Yeah.
So I think the last thing that we wanted to go over with everyone before we cover some of the questions is really like, a tabletop exercise. What would you do if one of your single sign-on administrators or your identity and access management administrators was an imposter? And what Dave and I want to go through with you is really like, these are really like the 5 critical things that you should be thinking about if you were to figure that out, right? And this is even before we get into the actual response and remediation side of this tabletop exercise. The first one is, what could you find out today? What are you logging in terms of being able to go, okay, so someone compromised my IAM admin. How could you go in and see all the things that they did during the time of compromise? And how long does it take you to do that? Because remember, if it takes you a really long time to figure out that it's still happening, there's more damage that's being done. And then you have to ask yourself, what were you missing? What could you not answer because you didn't have those logs, or you had to go ask someone else for them, or you even had to ask the provider for them, or they just don't exist and maybe you need to turn them on and increase the logging verbosity. And that's just pure investigations, right? Or forensics, just looking back in time at what happened. The first thing that you should do in that tabletop exercise is determine what you can find out and what you can't, and identify what those gaps are. And the second one is really ask yourself, like, was there anything that I could have done to detect this? And how can I implement and instrument those detective controls to have potentially avoided this or to move that detection to earlier in the kill chain? The last thing is, what could you have done even before this attack even took place to potentially minimize the damage or as we talk about it, Varonis, to reduce the blast radius of that attack? And these are really the things that you should go through in that tabletop exercise. Now, one of the things that we wanted to offer, everyone in our audience today and anyone that watches the recording of the show, if you want to sit down with the Varonis security expert and you want to go through this exercise, we actually have created an attack simulation where we can show you, how an attack would take place on a single sign-on provider, where someone would be able to, an impersonated administrator, go through a scenario that they would do in order to carry out that attack. And then we can talk with you about, what you would have been able to do to investigate it, potentially detect it, stop it, or again, reduce the blast radius ahead of time in order to lower that likelihood of attack. And what you guys are going to do right now is just get a quick question. If you want someone from the Varonis security team, from the Varonis team at large, to follow up with you about that, and you want to go through one of those exercises, just let us know. We're happy to go through that type of have one of our experts go through that session with you.
This imposter exercise reminds me, my kids play Among Us.
Yeah, red is definitely sus, if anyone was wondering.
So I think step one really needs to be call an emergency meeting.
Yes, we should call. One question that I want to cover, do we think that there is capacity to increase attacks both on the cybercrime side and on the nation state side? I'm going to answer cybercrime first. First of all, I believe there's almost unlimited capacity for cybercrime. It really only takes time and motivation for a person to carry out an attack. If there's anything that we've learned from LAPSUS, it's that sophistication isn't always required. Now, you can even think back to like email fraud scams, right? These are the most basic form of cybercrime. Someone that sends you an email that says, hey, I need you to send me or wire me $1 million and I'll wire you $2 million back. Or I need you to give me your username and password so I can reset your password because I'm from whatever vendor that you use. I mean, these are the most, infant forms of cybercrime, all the way up to the more sophisticated things like data theft and, zero-day exploits in order to deploy ransomware or in order to get an embedded foothold inside an organization. Absolutely on the cybercrime side. I think on the nation state side, it's really hard to tell. What that CISA article puts out there into the public domain is that these attackers get in and they stay there. They don't necessarily detonate or actually unleash the damage potential of their attacks. So those nation state actors might not have to do much more because they might already be inside of your environment or of one of those target type of environments. So absolutely, there is more capacity for nation states to carry out more cybercrime. The question is, are those nation states prepared for the consequences if they get caught? And I think a lot of times it's the consequences that prevent nation state actors from carrying out highly intrusive attacks. Another question that just came in, a lot of people asking some things about the going through that scenario. That's something that we've done in the past. We actually designed that SSO imposter scenario, and maybe if we've got one of our marketing colleagues or one of our co-hosts can tell us when we release that SSO imposter scenario. A lot of times what we'll do at Varonis is we'll create an attack scenario based on something that the Varonis incident response, forensics, and research team, the Varonis Threat Labs, actually witnessed in the wild. Like another good example other than SSO imposter that comes to mind for me is, this idea that MFA isn't a panacea. We have another scenario that we go through with clients where we show them how to do a man-in-the-middle attack to actually intercept and replay an MFA token and hijack a session cookie, which is just, again, like another way to kind of bypass what people otherwise think are really strong security controls. And as I scroll through the chat, I see a lot of really, really interesting comments, but I want to find one that somebody said earlier that I actually wanted to reiterate. And if you know who you are, this is like, thank you. In a global economy, hiring a hacker is like hiring a call center. They can be anywhere in the world and you can shop for the lowest price. Incredibly well stated. Now, lower price might come with lower quality, but you absolutely, and this is something that Devere, one of our colleagues from Varonis Threat Labs, showcased in our last session, which was how easy it is to go online and shop on the dark web for remote access into an environment or even just a list of credentials. Another person came in and said, are there any enforcements planned on the EU regulation? I don't think that we've got an idea of what the enforcement arm of the cybersecurity regulation is going to look like yet. But as we see updates on that and other proposed regulations, we'll be happy to share if there are any potential penalties that are associated with it.
Nice thread on treat hunting.
Yeah, I saw a couple people on treat and threat hunting. A lot of people saying that they like to do that around the spooky time in October. That's oftentimes when we'll go in costume to share with you the different threat actors that you should be concerned about. I think last year I was a spider, David, and maybe you were a spider as well. You want to refresh our minds?
The spider, the wizard spider costumes are definitely.
Oh, right, and the mummy spider and the wizard spider. Those were the actors we were concerned about then, and things have changed since then. I think it might not be too hard for me to dress up as a teenager in somebody's basement. I probably would just have to move my desk down into the basement and maybe use some dimmer lighting or some neon lighting, and I could pretend to be a basement teenage hacker.
Yeah, some treat hunting next month. Colorful eggs. Yeah.
Oh, that's true. That's true. Well, as always, we just wanted to say thank you. These shows are made possible by you, the audience, and we really appreciate your attendance and your contributions. And we look forward to connecting with you on our next episode of State of Cybercrime.
Thanks so much, Matt. Thanks everybody for joining.